I am Bob Kahn. I'm a member of the Learning and Retirement Committee, and I'm the host for today's presentation. It's truly an honor to introduce today's distinguished speaker. Yablonovitch has so many awards and achievements that I can mention only a small fraction of them. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, the National Academy of Inventors, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a foreign member of the Royal Society of London. He co-founded a number of tech-based companies. These produce antennae for cell phones, silicon photonic chips, designs for semiconductor fabrication, and solar cells. He received his undergraduate education at McGill and his graduate education at Harvard. He worked at Bell Labs and Exxon before becoming a professor at UCLA and ultimately joining the faculty here at Berkeley. He will speak today on how carbon negative technology can address the climate crisis. Let me just comment, it's a delight to see a positive sounding title in these days when we have so much negative news. I'm looking forward to having an optimistic view of our future.
Thank you very much. The title slide includes the word citrus, which is I gave this talk yesterday at Citrus, and so it's my privilege to give it again today for the Retirement Association, of which I'm a member. So yes, it's about carbon dioxide removal, and so let's get right into it. It wasn't that long ago when everything was about being carbon neutral, and but I thought there was something wrong with that, because it seems like there are certain aspects we cannot get rid of, certain forms of emissions of carbon dioxide. And so one of them is international aviation. So if we go to another continent, the time that the airplane can stay aloft depends upon the energy to mass ratio of the fuel. And jet fuel is the highest practical energy to mass ratio that's out there, and that enables us to stay aloft for a very long time. The point is you have to constantly be burning fuel to keep the rest of the fuel up in the air. And so you can do a little calculation. This is like a hard question for undergraduates, is given the energy to mass ratio, how long can it keep itself up in the air? And that corresponds to the question, what is the longest flight that one can take? And before the pandemic, you could take a nonstop from Dallas, Texas to Singapore. That was the longest commercial flight, and that was about 19 hours. And but we don't have anything else that compares with jet fuel for keeping us up in the air. And so we're going to be burning things like that and throwing them up into, just staying aloft. And aviation, it's a growth industry. It's not going away. There's another aspect in which we cannot avoid burning fuels. And we don't have, in spite of all the technology that's out there, we don't have a good way of storing energy from the summer to the winter. And I'm a solar cell expert, and I can tell you we have tremendous amount of energy in the summertime when it's sunny, and in the winter when we need the energy, we have very little solar energy. So we need to have seasonal storage. Seasonal storage is an unsolved problem, except with fuel that undergoes combustion. And so I used to be at Bell Labs, as mentioned, and I remember flying into Newark Airport, and the entire area around Newark Airport is filled with these big oil tanks, which store a huge amount of energy. But they do it so inexpensively that it adds maybe 1 or 2 pennies per gallon to the cost of the energy. And we need to have the cost very, very low, because we get to use this storage, we get to use it once a year. And so the cost has to be rock bottom. We simply have not solved that problem. Now, another issue is countries that do not cooperate. So whatever happens, there will always be some countries that do not cooperate. Well, you don't go to war. What you do is you send them a bill, and then you argue about the bill. Okay, and but nonetheless, you need to pull their carbon dioxide out of the air. So what it says is that carbon neutral is not enough. This was actually quite a radical thought about 6, 7 years ago. I sat on an APS committee and I told them we should be pulling carbon dioxide out of the air. And they said, well, that's too bold, and they didn't want to study it or anything. So the problem is that carbon in the atmosphere will grow unless we extract it. So we need a method of extracting it. So I have yet another reason is that in some climate models, positive feedback of CO2 from the permafrost can lead to thermal runaway. And so we don't know, we might already have gone too far. And so carbon neutral is not good enough. Carbon dioxide removal is needed. I should mention yet another reason for this is that when we use fertilizer, some of the fertilizer emits N2O, nitrous oxide, laughing gas. It emits that, and it's similar to carbon dioxide in that it stays in the atmosphere a long time, and it blocks the infrared radiation. So it's yet another reason. We need to remove carbon dioxide just to keep up with the N2O that we're emitting as a result of agriculture. The agriculture, we need it to live on. So basically, there's a bunch of reasons why we need carbon dioxide removal. So finally, about 5 years ago, this became a thing. And people realized, oops, yep, we're not going to get there unless we have a way of actually removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And there was a report from the National Academy of Sciences. And then the next one here is similar to the Europeans, not to be left out. They have the European Science Advisory Council, and they actually use the word negative. I'm trying to avoid using the word negative, but you do have to pull the carbon dioxide out of the air. And this led then to a Physics Today article capturing carbon from the air. And you can see the picture that most people have in mind as you pass the atmosphere through these pipes, and these pipes are filled with a chemical called amine, which likes to grab carbon dioxide. And then you have to heat up the amines so they'll emit the carbon dioxide so you can compress them and pump them underground. So that's one of the ideas that's out there. I think that's actually the most popular idea now. And at least in the amount of money being spent, about 3 weeks ago, the government announced that it was spending $1.2 billion to pull the CO2 out of the air, direct air capture. And some people claim it can be done for $600, but the government is going to be paying $1,000 per ton of CO2. Now, the problem with this is you need to get calibrated on these prices because we don't normally go to the supermarket to buy CO2. So I will tell you where I'm headed. I believe we have a way of getting the price down to $60 a ton, and I will cover that. And now the $60 a ton, you can use a little bit of high school chemistry and convert that to gallons of gasoline. And so for 53 cents a gallon of gasoline, if you get down to this price, then it's equivalent to adding 53 cents to the gallon of gasoline. You add the 53 cents, you pull out all the carbon dioxide produced by that gallon of gasoline. And so that's sort of the punchline. So I've given you the punchline already, but just to get an idea that there's some of the things the government is doing are irrational. I think it's irrational to spend $1,000 a ton. It's irrational to think of passing the entire atmosphere through some pipes, etc. There's a better way to do it, and I'll mention it. Now, if you look at the European report, there are a great many ideas that they put forward, and some of these have been discussed. You do forestry, you add forests, or you manage the existing forests. You do land management. In other words, you persuade the farmers to change the way they farm so the carbon stays in the soil from the roots. You can burn agricultural products. You can burn wood, and you can capture the smoke, and in the smoke you can pull out the carbon dioxide, and then you can pump the carbon dioxide underground. That has a fancy acronym called BECCS. That's also very popular. Here's one that's surprising. There are rocks that absorb carbon dioxide. Now, you have to grind the rocks up. The absorption rate is very low, and you have to spread this rock dust all over the world. And even then, it would be too slow. But it's an interesting idea. And then there's direct air capture and carbon storage. So that's the one that the government is spending $1,000 a ton on that one. And here's a more exotic idea. Ocean fertilization. You put fertilizer into the ocean, the algae grow, and then they die, and then they fall to the bottom of the sea. And of course, the problem is they don't all fall to the bottom of the sea, and it's sort of I would say it's sort of like a research topic, and you'd have to come back maybe in 100 years to see if it really works. On the other hand, there's what I'm going to talk about, which is the safe burial of agricultural biomass, which we call agro-sequestration. And surprisingly, in spite of all of these concepts put forward in the existing reports, there has been relatively little consideration of the safe burial of agricultural biomass. Now, the first person to propose this is a very famous person, and I just want to get some. I can't do show of hands and show my slides at the same time, but maybe someone can just type up. Have you heard of Freeman Dyson? One of the most famous and imaginative physicists of the 20th century.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah. So he already wrote a paper. Thank you for the feedback. By the way, we haven't had enough interruptions. In 1976, he wrote a paper saying we can just grow things, and he wanted to grow wood and just toss it underground. And he said, that's enough. And that's, so the idea is not a new idea, but somehow the Europeans ignored this idea. And there's a lot of misunderstanding, perhaps, or maybe it was an incomplete idea. It was a good idea, but needs some help. So I'm going to say how we help Freeman Dyson's idea, and I think it becomes practical. Okay, now the other evidence that now it's about carbon dioxide removal, there is now an X Prize, a $100 million X Prize, which the competition is going on right now, and 50 million to the winner. And so it's an indication that it has reached some degree of acceptance now, is that carbon neutrality is insufficient, and we must go to carbon dioxide removal. Now, I have on the bottom half of the slide, I have something else that is has to do with the fact that the CO2 concentration is very low. So let's say a plant captures, by photosynthesis, it captures CO2 from the air. So what's the problem? When it captures it, the plant makes food, or carbohydrates, and there's a lot of carbon in carbohydrates. So how do you go from a low concentration to like full density? And that actually costs a lot of energy. So the way to think about this, I don't know, probably not all of you are as tuned into entropy as I would like, but there's an entropy associated with this very low concentration, and then you have to concentrate it up to full density of wood or whatever, and there's a big energy cost associated with that. It's actually much more than 1/4 of an electron volt per CO2 molecule. And so where do you get the energy? Well, the plants are taking in sunlight, and they're providing free energy, and that's making up for the very dilute nature of the CO2. It has to be concentrated to full solid material in the plants, and the plants are a form of solar energy. So let's talk about the plants, and in this respect, we are very grateful to all the work done at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, starting about 15 years ago, on biofuels. And I'm going to be relying heavily upon the research that has already been done. Among the things they've done is to identify what is the best crop for each climate in the world. And so in the Midwest, it's this thing called miscanthus. And in Florida, it's called Napier grass. And even in England, which is so far north, they have their own preferred form of agriculture for this purpose. So you can grow biomass, and pull the carbon dioxide out of the air, and then safely store it. So I'll talk about this. So the crops, I mean, these are thoroughly studied by the biofuel people. You have your elephant grass and all those grasses. You have algae, also a candidate. Now, the thing about growing some of these plants plants do not produce food the way, let's say you grow corn, that's food. They produce cellulose, which is not readily digestible, but it's, so for one thing, the farmers don't have to use insecticides because the insects generally don't like to eat the stuff. And in general, it's a lot easier to grow these crops than to grow a food crop like maize. And I gave this talk in Europe, and I had to use the word maize because they think corn is wheat. Okay, and so immediately you have a lot more productivity of the farmland. It's much more productive if it's producing cellulose rather than producing actual food. Cellulose is 44% by weight carbon, which is good. Okay, and you can extract much more carbon from the atmosphere, about 3 times more than if you were growing a food like maize. And then you can say, okay, you're extracting it that from the atmosphere, and you would need 2 billion acres to extract all the carbon that's produced every year. So that's a lot, but let's analyze that as we go forward. Now, I have here a picture of a mentor of mine. And when I was a young man, I was working on solar cells, and the company I was with hired this guy, Al Rose, as a consultant. Al Rose was one of the leaders of the RCA research labs. And he, when he was a very young man in 1939, he actually invented the Vidicon camera. And he was my mentor. He would tell me things, and he told me once that I drove to work, and you passed some gas stations, he said, and you saw the price of gas. It was during one of the energy crises, and the price of gas was very high. And he said, why don't you go and look up get the Wall Street Journal, look up on the Chicago Board of Trade, what is the energy cost of buying corn? Well, they trade corn by the bushel, and then you have to convert units, and then the corn itself has energy, you can burn it. And so he said, figure out the cost of corn per megajoule and figure out the cost of gasoline per megajoule. So I went and I did that, and I was rather stunned to discover that the costs were actually similar. And so that was quite amazing. Of course, he was just teasing me. He didn't need me to do that because he had just written a paper on that at that time. And so from that moment onward, I had tremendous respect for agriculture. And as we all should, it is very cost effective at producing energy. It's close call. It's close call with respect to producing fuel. So from that time on, I was always greatly respecting agriculture. So we produce all this biomass, and we put it underground in an environmental chamber. And you'll see the key to putting it underground. This was already, Freeman Dyson had this idea, but the problem is it decomposes. And so how do you prevent it from decomposing? So I'm going to give you the secret right now is you keep it dry. And the way you keep it dry is the way you do with modern landfills. You seal it with polyethylene. Now, that's not like the polyethylene shopping bags. This is like 4 millimeters of polyethylene, which is like very rigid stuff, but it's very good. It's a material that is used. This whole technology is actually used today, but is used in reverse. If we produce garbage, we don't want it to contaminate the groundwater. In our case, we're doing it in reverse. So we don't want the groundwater to make our biomass wet. And it's a very clean, dry biomass, but we don't want it to be wet. So if you do that, you can sequester the carbon and therefore pull the carbon dioxide out of the air. So we went and we published this, and it came out in April with my co-author. My co-author is Harry Deckman. He used to work for me 40 years ago, and he retired. we got to work on this, and I give a lot of credit to him with coming up with the dryness idea. So let me address biofuel for a minute. So let's say you start with cellulose, and this is the approximate chemical formula of cellulose, and you're going to make fuel out of it. Now, the problem is you grow the stuff, and when you grow it, it's already half oxidized because it's got an oxygen on it. Okay, so biomass starts out as half oxidized. So if you're going to make fuel out of it, you end up having to grow twice as much biomass. So there's 2 acres of biomass to produce 1 acre of fuel, versus just taking the 1 acre and just dropping it in the ground, and you've pulled all that carbon dioxide out of the air. You get credit for pulling the full amount out. So already you see that there's a factor of 2 economic disadvantage. Already we're going to use a huge amount of farmland, and the thought of using twice as much really doesn't make sense. And so that's one of the problems with making biofuel. The other problem is the capital cost of the conversion. It's actually very hard to convert cellulose into fuel, and there's a lot of capital cost associated with that. Let's move on for biofuel. So what happens if you just throw stuff in the ground the way Freeman Dyson wanted? Well, there's and then you say, oh, I'll cover it over with clay, which it'll be anaerobic. And say, well, actually, that doesn't work, because there are bacteria that are perfectly happy in an anaerobic environment, and they will convert the biomass, so it's like cellulose, and convert it into CO2 and methane. And methane is even worse than CO2. And just burying it doesn't work. So how do we solve this? Let me point out yet another reason why simple burial doesn't work. I already gave you the chemical formula, but let's talk about wood. Wood has 2 major components, and one of them is lignin. So lignin is what gives the beautiful grain to the wood, and the rest of the wood is cellulose. Now, lignin is incredibly stable stuff, and to the degree that it caused an enormous amount of trouble in the biofuel research, because it was so stable, it was very difficult to convert it to a fuel. The cellulose they could work with. Okay, now if you throw the wood underground, the cellulose part decomposes right away. The lignin is very stable, and it provides strength to the wood. And so I wonder if any of you have had the experience, maybe gardening in the backyard, and you dig up a board that the contractors left it. When they built the house, they instead of properly disposing of the unnecessary wood boards, they threw it underground, and you dig it up, and you say, well, it's the shape of a board. It looks like a board, but it weighs almost nothing. It's like featherweight. And the reason is the cellulose is gone, and only the lignin remains. So it's only 30% by weight. And so it does work. The cellulose decomposes. You can get the benefit of sequestering 30% of the carbon dioxide that was originally made the wood. But of course, it's economically inefficient if you're only getting 30% of what you wanted or what you thought you should get. So that's the problem with throwing the wood underground. It works, but it only works at the 30% level. So how are we going to solve that problem? Okay, so I mentioned dryness. So what is a scientific way of saying dryness? So there's an expression called water activity. So water activity is scientific way of saying something is dry. Okay, now let's talk about the atmosphere. If the atmosphere is dry, we say it's a low humidity day. The relative humidity is very low. But what if you're dealing with a solid material? How do you express this? So the proper scientific expression is water activity, and it is proper to ask, what is the relative humidity equivalent inside this steak? Okay, and you wouldn't say relative humidity if it's steak, but the equivalent expression is water activity. It makes perfect sense to say the water activity is such and such, maybe 60%. And you'll see 60% is kind of an important number. So all biomass has some water and some water activity. And what if the biomass is very dry? And if you dry it, if you like you dried meat, it lasts a long time. It has a low water activity. And indeed, the anaerobic bacteria, they need moisture to undergo metabolic activity because they're moving chemicals around in the cell. And there are two government agencies that have studied this. And I'll mention the first one is the Food and Drug Administration. So if you have some product, you want to put it on the shelf in a supermarket, you want to prove to the Food and Drug Administration it's safe to put on the shelf. And you say, well, it's extremely dry. I wrapped it in cellophane and so forth. And the Food and Drug Administration says, well, is your water activity below 60%? It says, okay, then you pass and you can put on the shelf. So things that are dry do not decompose, and it suppresses dangerous organisms. Now, the other government agency that has studied this is NASA, because NASA is very interested in a life on other planets, and they wonder, well, how much water do I need for metabolism, for life to occur on other planets? So they study this very carefully, and I'll show you on the next slide. What happens is that as you lower the water activity, fewer and fewer organisms can survive. Bacteria need quite a bit. There are yeasts, mildews, other kinds of bacteria. And finally, you get down to 60% water activity, and all metabolism comes to a stop. And so this is an indication of how to suppress the decomposition of the biomass when it's stored underground. This is a picture from Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest. They have hunks of salmon hanging here drying. So it's the same story. You dry the fish, and they are stored. They are safe to store, and so 6% is sort of the magic level at which things don't decompose. So then you can look this up, and so this has been studied a lot. So you say, well, I want 60% water activity, which is equivalent to 60% relative humidity. I want to stay below that. And so how much weight percent water do I need, or do I have to drop below? So it turns out roughly 12%. So if you're below 12% by weight, and of course it's slightly different for different forms of biomass. This is miscanthus and hardwood and so forth. But roughly speaking, if you drop below 12% by weight of water, you also drop below 60% in the water activity. So there's sort of an interesting aspect of this. Let's say you're a farmer in the Midwest and you want to sell your corn on the Chicago Board of Trade. They have always had a requirement. We will not buy any corn unless it has less than 14% water. And so the farmers, before they bring their crop to market, they do have to dry it. And of course, in the old days, they would just protect it from rain, and eventually it would dry out enough so that they could sell it. And of course, nowadays they use propane and other things to speed up the process. So that gives you an idea that you could then put the corn on a ship, and you can send the ship halfway around the world, and the corn would not spoil before it reached its destination. So we need to keep the biomass dry. So we do it in this underground environmental chamber. I already showed this to you. And so here's something important. People worry that you'll be using up land, but the amount of land needed for this environmental chamber is, let's say you had a 1 acre, that would accept biomass from 10,000 acres. And so that gives you an idea. And then when it's closed after the growing season, you close it up, you cover it over with dirt, and it becomes farmland again. So that's the way to think about this. Now, why is this stable? Well, water diffuses through everything, but polyethylene really doesn't like water. And if you make it 4 millimeters thick, it takes forever for the water to diffuse through. In fact, if it's completely surrounded by groundwater, still only less than 2 microns of liquid water per year are going to diffuse through the 4 millimeters of polyethylene. And of course, the crop is dry when you put it in, so it can easily accommodate 2 microns equivalent of water for many thousands of years, because it can still absorb some water. The dry crop can absorb water and still stay below 60% water activity. So that's the way to think about the longevity. And that's why the polyethylene is rather thick at 4 millimeters.
Sorry, what do you mean by 4 microns of water?
Well, there's going to be some, 2 microns actually, there's going to be some water diffusing through the polyethylene. And so then you ask, well, how much? Well, you could express it in water vapor, how much water vapor diffuses through. I've chosen to express it in what the equivalent amount of liquid water diffuses through every year.
I see. So it's equivalent to a depth, in other words, along the full edge.
Yeah, and if you look at the environmental chamber, just for economic reasons, you don't want it to be too thin, so maybe you have 100-foot thickness that you build up, and so that small amount of water vapor is essentially absorbed by 100 feet of dry biomass, and of course it easily absorbs it and hardly changes its water activity. So that's the longevity factor. By the way, I appreciate the question. Please interrupt with more questions.
Do you have to worry about animals gnawing holes in the polyethylene?
Yeah, the way you handle that is to bury it deep enough. And we did I'm going to show you the economics. We did the economics for 20 meters of covering of dirt. So it's going to be 20 meters deep. And animals don't go 20 meters deep. But let's say you're worried about some crazy animal in the future. So then I said, well, we can go deeper. And it costs about 40 cents a ton. So we're at $60 a ton. It adds 40 cents a ton for every meter that we have to put it deeper. So it's the way you would solve that is to spend a little extra money and put the environmental chamber a bit deeper. But that's a good question. More questions? Please interrupt as I go along. Okay, so what is the size of the problem? Well, I have here a lot of text about the size of the problem, but it all comes down to 20 gigatons. 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide would have to be sequestered. Of course, part of the carbon dioxide is already absorbed by the earth. And so we're worried about the part that's not absorbed, and that's 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So it's a lot of carbon. So where are we going to get the land to grow all this agricultural, this biomass? Fortunately, the biofuel people have already figured that out, and they did an analysis of the agricultural resources, where you'd grow it, which crops you would grow, and so forth. So this is one large group paper from Lawrence Berkeley lab. I recognize some of the names. And there's also the Department of Energy itself put out a report. Where do you get the land, the agricultural resources to grow so much biomass? And so they analyze this, but I can sort of wrap it up in terms of this bar chart. So on this bar chart, all the land area of the Earth is represented by the width of the bar. And of course, at the North Pole and the South Pole, you have ice. You have other land that is totally barren, very difficult to do anything with. Okay, and then you look at the land that might be available. And so we have agricultural land, forest land, shrubs that are kind of useless, and even some freshwater lakes. That's included in the land, and cities and so forth. And they say, okay, we're just going to look at the agricultural part, and the agricultural part includes row crops. So 11% of the Earth's surface is row crops. So if you go to Iowa and you see mile after mile of corn, yeah, that's typical of about 11% of the Earth's surface, and it's corn, and it's wheat, and soybeans, and especially rice. Rice is actually the biggest row crop in the world. And the rest of the agricultural land is pasture land. And the amount that's needed to grow all the biomass to remove 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year is represented by this little blue rectangle. And the land comes primarily from pastures and forests and so forth. And this is all worked out by the biofuel people in this report. Okay, so the land, yes, it'll be a big industry. Be a tremendous new market for agriculture. And so what's it going to cost? So humanity has been doing agriculture for only 10,000 years. And what is the cost? And I mentioned that the biomass crops, they're non-food, they don't need so many inputs, not so much fertilizer, insecticides, and energy. So they're easier to grow. But let's figure out the productivity of land, and figure out what we pay for that, for let's say for the crops for 1 acre of land. Every country in the world publishes agricultural statistics, and so we can figure out from the price of the agricultural crop and the productivity of the land, we can figure out what does it cost a farmer to farm 1 acre, and it's roughly $500 an acre. And that's to pay for the fuel for the tractors and all the other things you need, including even renting the land. So it gives us an idea of what it costs per acre. And from that, we can figure out what is the sequestration cost. And by the way, there's a number of ways of doing this. So I like to do it by looking at it's like a sanity check. You go to Chicago Board of Trade, what are they paying per bushel and how many bushels do you get per acre? But other people prefer to do a bottoms-up analysis. And so my co-author did a bottoms-up analysis, and it comes out to be roughly the same $500 an acre. And so he did it for the different crops, miscanthus, switchgrass. A lot of people like these loblolly pines. And the bottom line is the agriculture ends up costing about $30 a ton. And this is not a complicated number because the agricultural industry is, they're always doing economic analysis of what it's costing them and how much money they make and so forth. Now, the environmental chamber is very similar to the way we build landfills. The most modern landfills are indeed sealed with 4 millimeters of polyethylene, which is like thick, hard stuff. And you can contract for that. You can go and ask someone who builds these and say, what's going to cost to build? And so that works out to be also about $30 a ton. And so we end up with combining the agriculture and the burial cost is $60 a ton of CO2. And if you do the other crops, they're not that different. Maybe the pine trees are not quite as productive as the other crops. So this is what it's going to cost. And so let's figure out what that is. So I mentioned already at the beginning, it comes out to $60 a ton, which is equivalent to 53 cents a gallon of gasoline. And we need to get rid of 20 gigatons of CO2. And so if we pay $60 a ton, it's a lot of CO2, and it ends up costing $1.2 trillion. But this is out of a world economy, which is about $100 trillion. So it would set back the world economy by 1.2%, but this is spread out over the next 100 years or so. And our productivity in general, economic productivity, grows maybe 2% a year. And so I think the world can deal with this. It's a setback, but the world can deal with it. So now we sent the paper off to be published, and we got a referee's report back and said, well, this is all well and good, but you really need to have some proof this is actually going to work. Maybe some natural experiment that occurred in nature that shows that if you keep things very dry, they don't decompose, even over very long extended time periods. So it turned out we actually had it. We decided we didn't put it in the paper, but then we changed the referee changed our mind. And so here is the evidence. So the evidence is not a natural experiment. It had to do with the politics of 2,000 years ago. So 2,000 years ago in Israel, there was a king, King Herod, and like most kings, he was afraid of being overthrown. So he builds a castle in the most easily defended location in Israel, which is this mesa called Masada. Is very famous. Tourists go there because it was the last holdout of the Jewish zealots who were finally defeated by the Roman legions. And so they were up on this part. But on these parts, King Herod built a castle. Some would call it a palace, but you can see it was meant to be very defensible because the walls are almost vertical. And but it's a unusual location. The base of the mesa was at the level of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea has now receded. You can still see it, but it's not up at the base of the mesa anymore. The top of the mesa is at sea level, but it's generally a very dry, remote, hard to get to location, and then you still have to climb these vertical walls and so forth. So it was pretty much abandoned for 2,000 years. And then a series of events happened. So I'm going to share with you in pictures what happened. So this is some kind of a portrait of King Herod. Okay, and he built his castle, they stored some things there, and then it is sort of abandoned. And then this guy, a pretty famous archaeologist, he goes and starts excavating in 1965. And he finds a bunch of things and publishes a bunch of archaeological papers. And one of the things he finds is these seeds that are the seeds of the date palm tree. And the date palm tree is a very common tree in those dry regions. And then it ends up in a drawer, and in where they keep the archaeological relics and so on. And then a doctor from a hospital in Jerusalem, she hears about this, and she charms the people who are in charge of the archaeological relics, and can you give me some of these seeds and I will have them carbon dated. So she has them carbon dated, and indeed they turn out to be 2,000 years old. She does the carbon dating in 2005. Okay, and then she gives them over to a horticulturalist and asks, can you germinate these seeds? And she germinates the seeds, and you get a little plant. And then the plant gets bigger and gets transferred over to a bigger pot. And finally, you have this plant. Now the plant this is a tree now. It's only 18 years old since 2005, but it was germinated from seeds that were 2,000 years old. And so this is rather remarkable. It's not the only one, but this is called Methuselah. You see, because of its importance, they put a wrought iron fence around it to protect it. But there are, I was told that there were 7 of these trees in southern Israel. So what does this prove is that biomass, if it's kept dry, will last for 2,000 years. The DNA will not decompose. The rest of the seed does not decompose, and it will still germinate. So this is the proof that dryness does indeed last for 2,000 years. And that should be sort of the end of the story. But I want to tell you a couple more things about agriculture. I told you I developed an enormous respect for agriculture. I would occasionally visit the University of Illinois, and I would turn on TV, and I would listen with fascination to the crop reports, because instead of telling what happened on Wall Street, it tells what happened to the price of the agricultural products that the farmers are growing. Now, Here's an interesting fact: is we've been doing agriculture for 10,000 years. Guess what? We got better at it with time. And so this is the wheat yield in the least developed countries. And you can see from 1960 to 2010, you had a doubling of the productivity of wheat. And this is very typical, not just for the least developed countries, but for all countries. And so I found some data that in England that went back to the 1700s about the productivity of land. And this is like, it's not in units of dollars, it's in tons of wheat per hectare of land. So it's actually a physical quantity. It's the amount that you actually produce. Of course, we know that the cost of food has gone down over the couple hundred years, but the part of the reason it's gone down is because the productivity of the land has actually increased. So if we start the graph at 1800, Malthus told us in around 1805 that the Industrial Revolution was pointless because people had more children and we wouldn't be able to feed them. And so he said the Industrial Revolution is pointless. Now, of course, it turned out he was wrong. Indeed, between 1800 and 1900, the productivity of land doubled. So that's not bad. But in 1905, Fritz Haber invents the process that is named after him for pulling nitrogen out of the air and making fertilizer. And so you go from 1900 to 1950. Oops, I'm off on the 1950 part. Okay. Go from 1950 and it doubles again, and then you go to 2000 and it doubles again. So basically, there is a Moore's law for agriculture. People think agriculture is not so advanced, but we've been doing it for a long time, and we tend to get very good at those things. And indeed, the agricultural yield has gone up by a factor 2 in the past 50 years, and a factor 2 the prior 50 years. And I think it'll continue to go up because we still have a long way to go. We have CRISPR. And part of the reason we have a long way to go is that the productivity of agriculture, let's say corn is 2% efficiency. The solar efficiency of corn is only 2%, and maybe 4 or 5% for the biomass crops, the biofuel crops. But solar panels are up at 29%, and the physics of what's going on inside a photosynthesis is very similar to what goes on inside a solar cell. So there is this possibility of greatly increasing agricultural yields, but it will require gene editing with CRISPR. So I think these lines will continue. It's like everything else. We get better at it, and we apply more technology to it. So that's kind of very promising for the future. But I'm not using any of these future improvements in the cost estimates. All the cost estimates are based upon current agricultural practices. This is another similar graph showing that, yes, we've gotten more efficient because to grow a fixed amount of food, the amount of land needed to grow a fixed amount of food has substantially dropped over the past 50 years. And we're using 68% less land to produce the same amount of food, which I think people have not been paying attention, have not noticed it. I notice it when I go back east and I travel around in New England, and I said, where are all the farms? And many of them, much of the land has been converted to woodlots because the New England farms cannot compete with the farms in the Midwest. So let's wrap up with the conclusions. So is this process scalable? Yes, it's scalable. Agriculture is one of mankind's largest industries. And the cost, I've already dwelt on the cost. It's rather reasonable. We're paying $6 a gallon of gasoline lately and another 53 cents. Maybe we can deal with it. Okay, and stability. So it's very important that the sequestration lasts a long time. And right now, people who are bearing wood are getting carbon credits, even though the wood is going to decompose underground. And so we have actual proof, an actual experiment started by King Herod that shows that the sequestration will last at least 2,000 years if we just keep it dry. And it's predictable in the sense that there's not a lot of scientific experimentation. We don't have to wait for hundreds of years to validate this approach. And some of the other approaches that are more high tech, it's sort of like, yeah, come back in 2,000 years when we know whether it works. This is going to work. And we can do rapid implementation. So we can contract with farmers in January and start pulling carbon dioxide out of the air in April. So in the next growing season. So I think this can fulfill a lot of society's needs. So, but I have to apologize that I'm a high-tech guy offering a low-tech solution. And I would say a low-tech solution makes more sense because you don't want to do something and then find out maybe it didn't work. The world generally does not like to take chances, especially with something that affects climate and also costs a lot of money. So we don't want to worry about how things will turn out hundreds of years from now. And I would say agro sequestration is proven for at least 2,000 years. So here's another amazing factoid. 40% of US corn is used for ethanol, which is kind of shocking. So you think of Iowa, which is a big state, a huge area. Imagine 40% of it is already dedicated for pulling carbon out of the air. Of course, unfortunately, the corn to ethanol is very far from carbon neutral, but it shows you that there's already a big commitment and a lot of land available right away. The farmers would be happy to switch to something that makes more environmental sense than gasohol. So well, obviously we should do more of it, but there already is about 6,000 acres of miscanthus in Iowa because they're using it to experiment with biofuel. And of course, we need more. And the great thing about it is that there's a pathway toward political acceptance because farmers are very politically powerful. That's how they're able to devote 40% of Iowa for producing gasohol, which makes no sense at all. And so this will be a new cash crop for farmers, and so they would be very happy. And this will help the politics of this. So let me conclude. Agro sequestration appears to be the lowest so far. There might be even lower. So far, the lowest scalable carbon dioxide removal technology. And in fact, in an emergency, it could remove historical carbon emissions because it's agriculture and can be expanded. But I would say we have to beware of complacency, the moral hazard in saying we don't have any problems, we don't have to do anything. No. We still have to do everything. We have to do conservation. We have to pursue alternative energy, decarbonization, other forms of sequestration. We need an all of the above approach. And actually, my co-author and I, we just started a company called AgroCapture Corp for carbon dioxide removal. There is a market for these carbon credits. We will have the highest quality ones because ours will stay sequestered. And actually, in this company, we're recruiting at all levels, from a member of technical staff all the way to CEO. So if you have some friends, tell them to send me their CVs. So we're currently living, as we know, in uncharted territory. Carbon concentration in the atmosphere higher than it's been in historical times. And I don't really have to say this, it's accepted now that carbon neutral is not enough. And we do need to have carbon dioxide removal technologies.
First of all, I want to say it was a fascinating talk, and I'm sure it's going to generate some interesting discussion.